Everyone, welcome back. Last time we were taking a look at some of the major changes that were happening in the modern world and how these changes are going to start to affect the visual arts as artists are representing the world that they're living in. They tend to reflect these changes within their works, and we examined what's going to become the symbol of the modern world with the Eiffel Tower. Kind of interestingly enough, Eiffel was known for another particular work that does become another symbol for its particular culture. And so how the Eiffel Tower is a symbol of France, his other structure, the Statue of Liberty, becomes the symbol of the United States and liberty and democracy. They're kind of inspiring this modern political changes that we've been taking a look at during this course. So it's kind of interesting that he does have this ability to be able to capture the essence of what a particular culture is. And even though might not be welcome at first, as we saw with the Eiffel Tower, it does tend to become ingrained. People start to change and adapt and to realize some of the messages that he's been able to encapsulate within his works. We've been taking a look. I've kind of showed you this image before. I wanted to tell you a story about how art changes from this, from Michelangelo to Kandinsky. And this is going to be particularly important because a lot of people are going to take a look at the modern art and they're going to say that this is ugly. And I wanted to explain what's happening within the modern world, why they're going this direction, why instead of kind of doing something like this, which they have the talent and ability to do, they decide to go this direction. And part of it is some of the changes that we've been taking a look at, and they're reflecting some of these changes. And we went through some of the major elements to think about and consider as we start analyzing modern art. The brushstroke is going to be different. Linear depth is going to be different. It's not necessarily going to be focused on representational art. It's more like going to be focusing on the interior mind of the artist and creating ideas rather than just creating something that's pretty. And then we also talked about how the definition of the art and the role of the artist are going to change within that. I wanted to kind of pick up within that discussion. We've been taking a look at Romanticism and some of the ideas of Romanticism in the last unit. I wanted to pick up with that theme and taking a look at realism. Realism is going to be really one of the first modern type movements, even though aesthetically it's going to look very similar to Romanticism. Its ideas are going to be kind of moving us towards the modern world. And so realism is going to have one foot kind of in the past as far as the art form is considered. But as far as its ideas are considered, it's going to have one foot in the future. And so realism was a literary and art movement during the 1850s that was a counterpoint to the Romantic era. Rather than capturing romantic fantasies and emotionalism, realists focus on the gritty realities of everyday life. And so they're taking a look at these changes of urbanization and they're reflecting these changes. The working class was one of their main subjects, which they portrayed with seriousness and sophistication, which is going to be different from the previous era, which generally, Romanticism we saw with Garicall, Pity the Sorrows of a Poor Old Man, how they're suggesting that if you're only focusing on universals, you forget the individual. And so they want us to kind of think about the individual who might be suffering at the expense of the majority. And so in some ways, Romanticism does this, but they kind of do it in a kind of an overly dramatic sort of way. Realism is going to portray it a little bit differently. I want you to think about those differences. This movement became one of the major stylistic and thematic influences of Impressionism, and so their ideas are going to be embedded with Impressionism, even though aesthetically, the way it looks, Impressionism is going to be very different. We've talked about the Academy before, the Association of Writers, Thinkers, Artists that maintain professional standards. They would have a panel of judges to determine if the work of art meets its standards. And so what we're going to start to see is that artists are starting to move away from that, to become independent of that. And this is where the modern art world really starts to take root. Let's take a look at Millet and some of Millet's ideas within the Sower. What we see within this, again, is focusing on some of the difficulties of the modern world. This is the modern agrarian farmer who's out there sowing the field, throwing his seeds with his hands, right? And he has a little pouch here where he has more seeds. And as he's kind of walking through the field and throwing them, And then behind him, you have the birds, these kind of crows that are flying overhead and that are eating the seeds as he plants them. And so what we see within the modern world is this struggle for survival, right? That we see a different kind of view of nature, that nature might not necessarily just be waiting to nurse us, as Wordsworth says, or like the jungle that we see within Kipling's The Jungle Book, right? When just being there in order to nurse us or nurture us into adulthood, that nature has some destructive capabilities, that nature is this survival of the fittest. And so we start to see some of those philosophical ideas starting to kind of take root and to shape and influence the way that we see ourselves. And in some ways, even though I'm not necessarily sure how much Millet knew about Marx, Karl Marx wrote the Manifesto of the Communist Party in 1848, and this one is 2 years later. And so to think that there would be a French translation, Marx wrote it initially in German, 2 years later, I don't know. It's a bit of a stretch, but what we see is that he's maybe reacting to some of the same concerns that Marx has, right? That the working class definitely has struggles. And so it's not only struggling against nature and the environment, but struggling within their own societies, that life, that capitalism is this kind of struggle for survival. Notice how the darkness around the eye of the sower, where he doesn't necessarily have that individuality, so he's kind of this representation of the modern man. The modern hero is someone that's going out there and fighting. So this is the everyman, kind of the common elements. We see some similarities to some Protestant or Calvinist ideas that we've seen before during the Baroque era. This is Messi's the idle servant. And what we see within this one is the ideas that you need to be industrious, you need to work in order to find virtue. And we see similar elements, these residual elements happening within Millet's narrative here about the sower, that the common working class isn't necessarily poor because they're lazy. It's poor because of other extenuating circumstances. And so it's fighting against that Victorian narrative that if you that everyone has access to the bourgeoisie dream and everyone can have this class mobility. Therefore, if you are poor, you must be lazy or choosing to be poor. And Millet's kind of pushing against that narrative. We're going to see modern artists continue to push against that as the common dominant way of seeing the world. Modern artists are kind of pushing against that and calling it into question. And we see further ideas of this with the gleaners. A gleaner is someone that goes in and lives off of what other people discard. Right, and so within the urban city, a gleaner would be those that would come in and collect things that other people are throwing away. And within this particular work in 1857, these three gleaners are going into a field after the harvest. And so you can see the harvesters kind of packing up, right? They have their wheat and they're going off to the mill. But it wasn't worth their time to slow down and pick up each individual grain. And so they kind of just go in really quickly to pick up the majority of it. But these three women are willing to go through the field and pick up what was left behind. And so again, what we see are the lower classes and how they're forced to live within this capitalist world. And so maybe capitalism isn't this perfect panacea, this kind of giving more people access to more wealth and more security and increasing the standard of living. Maybe there's some people on the bottom that are actually being exploited and experiencing problems as a result of that. And so here, what's kind of interesting about Millet is he decides not to represent these three women as, foolish or lazy. or even overly romantic. He just portrays them as hard workers. They're kind of bent over, kind of hunched over in an unnatural kind of posture. Their back's hurting. But yet they're willing to do this. So maybe the poor aren't just lazy. Maybe the poor have some type of virtuous elements. And we're going to see that within Impressionism. Impressionism is going to take that idea and kind of run with it within their works, or at least some Impressionists are going to do this. But there's kind of this noble work ethic within these three individuals, even though society has kind of forgotten them and they're reduced to picking up the remains of others. They don't necessarily, it's not as though they're out in the streets begging for money. They're actually out there working in order to support their families. I wanted to introduce Impressionism to you by taking a look at this particular pixelated work. This is going to be a small detail of a larger work, but it's going to capture some of the ideas that I want you to think about. If I was to just show you this particular image, what would you say this image is of, right? So if you were just to take a look at this and make some assumptions, what's being represented here? And some people take a look at this and they say, well, it looks like a hill, right? So it's kind of a hillside here. Maybe this is a tree. That could be some. Some people say maybe it's just the bottom of someone's legs, right? So these are two legs that are here. Some people suggest that this could be a squirrel, right? A little head here and then a long bushy tail here. Some people kind of take a look at this and they start to make some assumptions. But as I show you the larger image, and I ask you, what is it that you see? And that what you were looking at was this kind of detail here. If I was to ask you what is down here, most of people would say that this looks like a boat. And the follow-up question I have of this is, well, how do you know it's a boat, right? And people would generally respond, well, it looks like a boat. And I'm like, well, it's the same image, right? It's the same paint that you saw in the previous image. But what you have now is context, right? So they assume that it's a boat because it's dark here, and then it looks like this blue-gray kind of and yellow here, which they assume is water. And they start to kind of further make this assumption. I'm like, well, how do you know it's water? And they say, well, this spot here looks like the sun because I know the sun is kind of yellow or orange. And then I see some of that same color kind of here. It looks like a reflection. And so the blue and the green and then this reflection here, this kind of orange and yellow here, looks like it's just reflecting the sun. And so then they said, therefore, this black blob of paint, therefore, must be a boat, right? And I would say, yes, you're absolutely correct. But what I'm trying to get you to see here is exactly what Impressionism is seeking to do. What they argue is that they don't necessarily need to give you all the details, that your eye can pick up visual cues based on other elements. And so what they're seeking to do is they're suggesting that they can paint an image without actually trying to create exactly visual reality that we see with the Renaissance, but they can just give you a sketch or an impression of that reality, and then your eye can do the rest. And so in some ways, this is a study for how the eye sees, and this is kind of an introduction to Impressionism. Impressionism was an art movement that began in the 1860s and culminated in the 1870s. Artists were frustrated with the French salons, which turned down over 3,000 works in 1 year. So the idea is they couldn't break into it. It was becoming too exclusive. So they decided just to do their own exhibition. Impressionists band together to create their own exhibition of art in 1874, which is technically the first official year of Impressionism, to rebel against the rigid restrictions of the Art Academy, which strictly defined what art was and what was not art. One work of art in this exhibition was Monet's Impression Sunrise, and this is where the idea comes from. The work captures the movement's desire to capture sensory perceptions and study how light and shading influence a work of art. Thus, the movement became known as Impressionism. And so what you're going to see with Impressionism is this kind of very quick kind of sketches that are applied to a canvas. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to capture the light and shading before the light changes. And so what you have during this time is you have paint that's being, for the first time, is available in tubes. And that enables the artist to be able to take the studio outdoors. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to paint outdoors. and to paint how light changes a particular object. And we'll see that particularly with Monet. And they're trying to capture it quickly because if you do this too long, right, the sun is going to change, and it's going to change the entire image. It's going to change the shading of the image, and so they're trying to capture it really quickly. Some of the top principles of Impressionism are to capture literal interpretations, and so in some ways it's supposed to be like a Polaroid, trying to capture kind of this immediate literal interpretation without necessarily this kind of romantic commentary. And so there's going to be some commentary in some Impressionist works, but generally they're just trying to give you the image, right? Impression Sunrise isn't necessarily trying to tell you about the monarchy and how we need to revolt against the monarchy or anything. It's just Impression Sunrise. And so it's mainly just supposed to just capture the scene that it's representing. It's supposed to examine sensory knowledge, how the eye sees. It's supposed to focus on the play of light and how light and shade interact and change a particular work. Generally, Impressionists capture everyday life, trying to capture what people do on a day-to-day basis, such as fishing in a boat, as we see with Monet's Impression Sunrise, or urban scenes, particularly of Paris. We talked about how Paris becomes the artistic center of the world and how it's starting to urbanize, and they're interested in these changes, and so they want to capture them. They paint and apply quick, short strokes, and so they're not trying to disguise the hand of the artist. And so in some ways, their works become a little bit more abstracted because of that, in a manner that resembles more of a sketch. And what we see is wet paint applied to a canvas in order to speed the process of painting. It says wet paint applied to wet paint, but I think what I meant by that was wet paint applied to the canvas in order to speed the process of creating softer lines. But as you apply wet paint to wet paint, you can kind of create new colors, new color schemes within that. But again, it's focusing on that new invention of putting art or paints within a tube. A couple of rejections that we see with Impressionism. Number one, it rejects artists or artistic emotion, right? That's too much embedded within Romanticism, and they're trying to remove their bias from a work as much as possible. It's a rejection of artistic imagination, adding to, enhancing a narrative. Now, that's a little bit of a misnomer, I think. This rejection of artistic imagination, they're not necessarily trying to elongate, as we see with Ingres's a large odalisque where he elongates the spine and elongates the arms. And so they're not necessarily trying to capture the artistic imagination and just kind of to exaggerate certain things. They're trying to literally interpret the world that they're seeing. However, as they do this, they're going to have to choose what's going to be most important. And so they are going to make some artistic interpretations as they focus on what elements to emphasize and what elements to not emphasize. But it's in some ways a rejection against that romantic exaggeration. It's a rejection of the glorification of the irrational. So again, it's not necessarily trying to promote things that are beyond the senses. It's really trying to first focus on how the eye sees and to study that. And it's going to be an impression of how the eye sees. And it's a rejection of an individualistic style. It's going to be some commonalities that we're going to see that are common to all Impressionists. Some of the influences of Impressionism. Number one is photography, and we've talked a little bit about this. The development of the camera in the 19th century changes the art world. One of the major aspects that influenced modern art was photography. Photography began in the early 19th century. By the mid-19th century, people could have their portraits taken by anyone, threatening the painter's dominance over the visual art. Artists such as Paul de la Roche said, "From now on, painting is dead." And I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but you can sense the threat that the camera poses within that. Indeed, painting in the old way was dead. I think he was true in some ways. Artists could not compete with the ease and quickness of the camera. Their monopoly on portraits and creating visual histories was over. They now had to compete with science. And so they're going to do this differently. And they're going to mainly turn inward, as I've mentioned before. Another major development that influenced Impressionism was Japanism. In 1848, the U.S. opened trade markets with Japan, which previously was cut off from the West. As such, Japanese art entered Europe for the first time. And there were Japanese art exhibits in Paris and London in the 1850s. Artists who were interested in expanding their artistic principles of the West turned to Japanese art as a way to create something new and different. And so as Impressionists were kind of thinking, well, how do we do something different from the Renaissance, right? All of a sudden you have it almost at the same time, all of these Japanese works coming in, and they say, hey, this is totally different from what they've done in the Renaissance. Let's kind of do something different. Impressionists who were resisting the values of the Renaissance found in Japanese art new ways to frame and construct an image. Japanese art was exotic and refreshing to them. It represented new techniques that were previously unexplored or considered taboo. Artists such as Monet and Degas copied Japanese art. Monet had 231 Japanese prints and continually returned to them for inspiration throughout his life. And I went to Monet's estate at Giverny. I'm going to talk a little bit about this later. But he had, at his estate at Giverny, he had a lot. I got to see a lot of these prints that he was able to have access to. But it shows the influence, right? That kind of the Japanese influence within Impressionism. So we can't really study Impressionism without actually paying at least some tribute or acknowledgement to this. The influence of Japanese art on the West is called Japanism. And one of the things that Japanese art offers is a new way of seeing linear depth, right? And so this is going to be something that's going to continue on within the modern art. It's going to start with Impressionism. It's going to continue on with Post-Impressionism and even Symbolism. And as we get to finally Expressionism, we're going to see these ideas continually be expanded upon. But in the old way, right, the old kind of Renaissance way that we talked about with Brunelleschi developing, we have this vanishing point with the horizon line and all these orthogonal lines that are pushing towards the central axis to give us the illusion of depth. What we see with Japanese images is something very different than that. There's not necessarily, we see that this mountain, for instance, is further in the background to us than this cliff and this gentleman who's walking along the cliff is. We get that sense of depth, but it doesn't necessarily have to follow that rigid kind of these orthogonal lines. We can just see that the lines here just kind of naturally flow to the back, or as we see with the wave. This one's kind of a famous print from Japanism. As we see with the wave, I mean, we get the sense of depth here, as though the wave kind of comes up and crashes, and we get the sense that part of it's a little bit further away from us than, this foreground part. But it's not necessarily doing things in the same way, right? It's not necessarily pushing those rigid lines in the same way that Renaissance art is. And so what we're going to see with Monet and Impressionists is they're heavily influenced by this. And so even though this water lily here is supposed to be closer to us than the water lilies in the back, it's not necessarily following any type of line, right? He could just say we can just give that same sense without having to follow the same kind of methods that the Renaissance art is. And so this is kind of one of the first major steps away from the Renaissance. Critics of Impressionism were a lot. They were kind of, as Impressionism came out and they did their own exhibit in 1874, people took a look at their art and they said it was disgusting. Now we kind of see it as the standard, but it's very and it becomes kind of ingrained within our kind of society, and everybody kind of loves Monet. I haven't really found anyone who hates Monet and his art. But that's kind of par for the course. Art at first is generally, at least avant-garde art that's doing something different, art that's pushing the boundaries of tradition, is generally going to be, there's going to be a strong reaction against it at first. And we saw that with Eiffel Tower, right? We saw that kind of the strong reaction against it. But as artists are representing the world that we created, and sometimes they hold up a mirror to society and people don't really like what they're looking at. They would rather look at rainbows and unicorns and kind of this kind of fairy tale than they would actually take a hardcore look at what reality is like and what we really are. And they don't really, generally people tend to not like things that are new or different. And so we tend to have this opposition. And so these are just two of many that I could choose from, critics of Impressionism. One person said, "Try to make Monsieur Pissarro understand that trees are not violet, the sky is not the color of fresh butter, and that no sensible human being could countenance such aberrations. Try to explain to Monsieur Renoir that a woman's torso is not the mass of decomposing flesh with the purplish green stains," right? So they take a look at their work and they're just like, it's just unfinished. It just doesn't look polished. And Impressionists respond to that as they say, yes, exactly, right? Or this one by Leroy, he says, Impressionist wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished, right? And so some people take a look at Impressionist work and they say it's just sketch, right? Where's the completed object? And if you study art enough, you'll start to see that most artists, before they complete their masterpiece, they'll have several sketches that help them with the design, help them with the composition, help them to know where things are going to go or how colors are going to work. But Impressionists just give you the sketch, right? They don't give you the finished work. And in a sense, that's kind of representative of the modern world. That's constantly changing. There's a different pace associated with it. And so there's no time to do anything else. And so they just kind of give you this kind of unfinished image. But in a similar way that we see with Eiffel's Eiffel Tower, what he gives us is just the bare bones, kind of the naked sculpture without trying to conceal it. What we see with modern art, with Impressionism, is they're just giving you the raw, bare bones, kind of the naked image without trying to formalize or to finish it. We just see it in its raw stating, or raw situation. What we see, I just kind of want to take a look at Picasso and Picasso's ideas here, even though Picasso comes later, and we'll study him for later in the semester. He does say something that really captures the essence of Impression sunrise. He says, there are painters who transform the sun to a yellow spot, but there are others who, the help of their art and their intelligence, transform a yellow spot into the sun. And I think that's what Impressionists are seeking to do. They're not just trying to give you the paint. They're trying to immerse you within the work. And as I stand in front of Monet's, I mean, at first you kind of think, well, it looks a little fuzzy. But then all of a sudden, as your eyes start to relax, it feels as though you can just reach through the painting and touch the water. Impression sunrise. I just wanted to tell you a quick story here, just as a bit of a digression. But Impression sunrise is a bit elusive to me. I've always wanted to go see it firsthand. I've been to Paris several times, and it's currently housed in a museum called Marmottan. This kind of little tiny museum that's here. And I went in 2018 with my wife for a week or so, or 10 days, to Paris. And we went to many museums. And one of the main museums I wanted to go to was this one, to see this specific painting. I wanted to see Impression Sunrise because I teach it all the time. I'm fascinated by it. But when we got there, right, the day that we got there, or I put this at the very end of the trip for whatever reason. I don't know why. I think I was just like, well, we were kind of busy doing other things, and I'm like, oh yeah, we need to go to Marmottan before we leave. Well, the day before we were leaving on Saturday, and that Friday, we went there, and it was closed, and it closed the day before. And it was going to be closed for the next 2 weeks. And so I missed it by like a day, right? And so I'm like, I was so frustrated, but I'm like, okay. So last year in 2018 or 2019, I led a group of students to Europe, and we went to London, we went to Prague and Venice and Vienna and Florence and Rome, and we ended up in Paris. And we were it was the same kind of spiel, right? It was kind of the last day in Paris, and I still hadn't gotten, I was just kind of busy doing other things. Hadn't gotten to go to Marmottan to catch up with Impression Sunrise, but I vowed I wouldn't leave France without seeing Impression Sunrise. And so the last day, all the students wanted to go to Versailles, and I highly recommend that. But I've been there several times, and I'm like, but I haven't gone to see Impression Sunrise. And so as I kind of sent the students off to go to Versailles, I decided to go on the other side of town to Marmottan. And I went there, and I got in. It wasn't closed, so I got to go in. I'm like, this time, Monet and I are meeting up, and in some ways we did. There's a lot of Monets in there, but Impression Sunrise. This is what I saw. There was just this little tiny painting about the size of 2 inches by 2 inches on the wall of Impression Sunrise, and it said this at the very bottom. This work of art, Impression Sunrise, is on exhibition at the National Gallery in Australia until September 5th. And I was there on September 4th, 2019. So again, I missed it by a day. And so one day, my dream is to go and actually see Impression sunrise firsthand. But it's an elusive painting, at least for me. It almost seems as though it's mocking me in some ways. But I want to take a look at some similarities, right? As we take a look at this, some things I want you to think about in your notes are, what are the similarities between realists and impressionists, and what are the differences? As you take a look at their aesthetics, how they're representing their works or the themes that they're representing, what are some similarities and what are some differences that you notice? And then as we take a look at Romanticism, right, what are some similarities and differences that you notice between Impressionism and Romanticism? And so think about that as you're going through these works. And so something to consider. I want to take a look at a couple more Monet images. This one is not elusive. I actually have seen this one. This one is in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. This one's called Rouen Cathedral. And Rouen is just a city in France. And they have, like every city, they have a cathedral. And so Monet kind of puts his canvas out there and he paints it. And he paints it several times, right? He paints it in the morning, he paints it at noon, and he paints it at sunset. And so what he's doing, again, this helps to visually represent what Impressionists are concerned with. And mainly what they're concerned with is how light and shading influence work, right? Too much shading doesn't give you the details, but also too much light does the same thing. It oversaturates the work, and so you can't necessarily see the details. And so he's kind of painting these in kind of an assembly line fashion and just kind of painting as quickly as he can. But in some ways, that's representative of the modern world, right? It's kind of doing things of the quicker pace with the introduction of trains and subways and whatnot. The world is starting to get faster, and so he's trying to represent that. He eventually retires. Monet goes away from the busyness of the city. We'll take a look at a couple other Impressionists, but I want to just kind of leave off with Monet. He eventually kind of gets outside the outskirts of Paris. This is about, I would say, is about 40 minutes outside of Paris. And in 2018, while we were in Paris, before we were one of our failed attempts to go see Impression sunrise at Marmottan, we decided to kind of take a day and go out to Giverny, where Monet retired, and this is his home. And I wanted just to show you, as we went through the tour, I've talked a little bit about how he had a lot of Japanese prints around the house. Went through his kitchen. I got to go see his bedroom, and you can see some of the Japanese prints that he has that kind of adorn the house to show that influence. This is his backyard. This is what he's seeing. So this is what he's waking up to as he becomes a very successful painter. Even though at first he wasn't really accepted, or the Impressionists weren't accepted, they eventually become the standard and widely accepted. And so then he retires. And this is his backyard. And then there's another bridge. You can kind of walk through this. You get to walk through Monet's garden. You can kind of walk back, and then there's this pond here that you can walk through. And so for the rest of his life, he spends painting these water lilies in his backyard. And he paints them during the spring, he paints them during the fall and the summer and the winter. And what's interesting about it is just the use of colors that he chooses to paint. It gives you the sense of the season, right? Even though it's pretty abstract. And this one is an entire work that he did specifically for the L'Orangerie in Paris, which is another museum. This one is huge, and this one actually, this is kind of me standing next to it with a dazed look in my eye. I don't know what I was thinking at the time, but anyway, it kind of goes around the entire image, and it gives you a kind of a circular feel to it, and so you're really immersed within the work. And so his works become more and more become larger and larger, and the actual brushstrokes become more thicker and they become less and less precise. And so I just want to give you a couple of details of the brushstroke. But even as he becomes more and more abstract, we still get a sense of, the field here, and then the hill in the background, and the sense of colors. And so traditionalists would take a look at this and they say, well, what hill is actually lavender? There's no lavender hill out there. But as we kind of think about it and we just kind of immerse ourselves with it, the colors interacting with the atmosphere and the atmosphere interacting with the colors of the field, and that we do get a sense that this is what, reality kind of looks like. And then as he gets older in life, this is another one of his water lilies. This one was actually at Marmaton when I went last year. This was one of the works that was there. I didn't get to see Impression Sunrise, but I did get to see this one. This just gives you a sense of how abstract he starts to become with his older age. And this is kind of the direction of where art is going, getting more and more abstract. I want to take a look at a couple other Impressionists that are around that are contemporaries to Monet, just to give you a sense of what other particular individuals are doing. And this one, Manet's A Bar at Folies Bergère, is one of the main works of Impressionism that give you a sense where Monet's mainly painting outside. Some artists kind of take the canvas indoors, and they're really focusing on some more socio-political concerns, and we see that with Manet. Manet's father was a businessman, and his father did not want him to become an artist. However, Manet refused. He refused to become a businessman like his father. He wanted to express himself. And so, and I think the world is better for it. I mean, there's a lot of business people out there, but there's a lot less people out there willing to change the world through their art. And so I think we're all kind of grateful that he decided to go this particular direction. But I just want to take a look at this one in particular. And it shows some of the elements that I want you to think about, right? Is first of all, as we take a look at this particular woman's face, I want you to think about the physiognomy, right? What's the face telling you? What story is it telling you? And if we take a look at it, she seems kind of vacant. She seems kind of dazed, right? And then the question is, well, who is she looking at, right? That's another question for us to consider. And one explanation is maybe to us, right? Maybe she's looking at us with this kind of glazed look, and it kind of gives us a sense that we're going up to the bar and then we're ordering from her who's taking our order. But then again, it could be that, because if you take a look in the background here, we can see that there's this mirror that's back here. So this looks like this is the back of her head, and so maybe who she's looking at is this gentleman, right? And so maybe that's the idea that she's perhaps examining, or at least looking at or interacting with. But what we see within this particular work is we see the separation, the divide between the working class and the upper class, right? This kind of bar is not just a bar to hold this kind of nice, these tangerines here, but it's actually a physical barrier that separates the working class from the upper class. And so in some ways, this is a socio-political commentary on this capitalist world that they're finding themselves in. This idea of questioning the bourgeoisie dream. Can she just, jump out from behind the bar and join this crowd? And the answer is no. She doesn't have the finances for it. And so it shows you some differences with the people that are actually in front of her, although visually to us, they're behind her in the mirror. We see the very wealthy out. This is the new bourgeoisie, the industrialists that are kind of rising to power at the time. They're out having their leisure, having their drinks, having entertainment. Here's an acrobat just kind of performing for them. But getting us to think about some of the aspects of the bourgeoisie dream, getting us to confront our participation as we become kind of the participants within this. What is our participation within this? I want to take a look at a couple of other Manet works. The Absinthe Drinker here. We see an absinthe as a very potent narcotic. I think we've talked about this in a previous lecture. Very cheap, though, and gets people pretty drunk. And here we see the absinthe drinker. This is a homeless man who's out there who doesn't really have an industry, right? He's just kind of left to his own devices. Or the philosopher, or also called the beggar with oysters. And I'm not necessarily sure why Manet entitles this person a philosopher, beggar with oysters. Is this some type of harsh commentary on what philosophy degrees to give you? I don't think so, because I think there's a lot you can do with a philosophy degree. I think what he's suggesting is that that the poor have greater insights, maybe see greater truths, or able to see parts of society, see the underbelly of society, the being ignored and kind of discarded and overlooked. that other people generally don't, right? They're able to see past some of the propaganda that's out there. Or this one, that the rag picker, and he paints these in somewhat of a realistic fashion, somewhat of a romantic fashion, kind of blending them a little bit. But he paints them in a way that gets us to see them as individuals, right? To see their individual plight. That these are individual. I mean, it's really easy to just take a look at the poor and say, well, the poor are just lazy or whatever, and be dismissive of them. But if we see them as individuals, we start to see their humanity. And so he's trying to confront us with that humanity. Not all Impressionists are doing exactly the same heavy-handed political commentary that others. Renoir is much more of a fluffy kind of painter. His images generally paint the upper class and some of the leisure of the upper class, and so we don't necessarily see as the lower classes and the harsh commentary. But I think some people could argue that the removal of the lower classes is a commentary in of itself, right? They kind of swept underneath the rug and saying those are kind of the less savory elements, and so let's not look at those. Let's just pretend that everything is wonderful and everything is happy. Generally, Renoir wanted to paint these kind of overly happy images, and he would use, rather than actual real people, which most Impressionists would do, he was actually one that kind of deviated from that and painted more models. He wanted to give you kind of the essence of what this bourgeoisie dream was all about. And so he was all about the bourgeoisie dream, and this was the Moulin at the Gillette. And so this is just it's otherwise known as the Pancake Mill, which is just a particular section in Paris where people would go and to have entertainment. And so as you think about these, right, as you start to think about the comparisons and the differences, when you think about what similarities and differences do you see between them, right? As you see different Impressionists dealing with the modern world, they're going to have different voices, and I want you to think about what their argument is, what their thoughts are. Let's take a look at Degas. Degas has some interesting ideas represented within his work. I think we've taken a look at this one before, The Absinthe Drinker, where this woman goes into a bar as a dead in the pain. So this is of the frustrations of trying to make ends meet and just not being able to, just because rent is so high and employment and wages are so low that she feels kind of pressed in between in order to try to make those ends meet. And so she just kind of goes in, and this modern world weighs on people. It's not necessarily that perfect panacea that we see with Renoir, or that we see kind of promoted, that we're all headed towards a better end. We see that there's some negative aspects to it. And so in some ways, we can see a similar argument emerging within Manet's Bar at Folie Bergère and The Absinthe Drinker with Degas. Similar kind of commentary that we see. And so even though Impressionists are really concerned about capturing the modern world, they're not necessarily all of them are trying to capture just the beauty and desires and hopes and dreams of the modern world. Some of them are trying to get us to see some of the things that we tend to overlook or not see. Degas' rehearsal on the stage, Degas mainly known for his ballerinas. That's what he's mainly known for. And some people take a look at this and they say, well, this is the entertainment of the upper class. I mean, most, poor people aren't going to be going to go see a ballet, right? That's more of the entertainment of the upper class, or the newly emerging upper class, the businessmen, the people that can afford it to go to leisure. This is what they're entertained with. But instead of just focusing on that, right, as we would see with Renoir, which is paint this as a very kind of light, nice, fluffy kind of image, if we look a little bit deeper, we can see that there are people that are, working long hours, their shoulders are aching, their back is aching, right? And so we see that there is some, even though ballerinas and going out, this is about the entertainment of the upper class, we do see that there are some kind of interesting dichotomies emerging within Impressionist art. And so it's not necessarily just about being fluff or there's nothing there. It's about they do have some harsh criticisms within them. I also want to take a look at how they're changing that one-point perspective, where before with Leonardo, you see that all points are converging at the end. What we see with Degas is he takes that canvas, and rather than painting it straight on, he takes it to the very far left of the stage, which gives us a very sharp angle as we look forward, as we take a look at these ballerinas. And so he's doing something a little bit different. This is kind of one of the first major steps of questioning that one-point perspective that we see within Impressionism, right? That influence of Japanismo that we see with Monet. Impressionists are continuing that as we take a look at their questioning that one-point perspective. And so again, what I want you to think about, right? Do you think that Degas is celebrating the modern world like Renoir, or do you think he's critiquing it like Manet? And again, I'm just getting you to think about the different voices of Impressionists and what they're seeking to do, what they're seeking to capture. Let's kind of take a look at Caillebotte and his Paris Street Rainy Day. Kind of an interesting commentary that we see here. Just kind of quickly go through. So what we see with Caillebotte, he was part of the upper class, and he was really one of the ones that was, when one of the Impressionists needed money, that they would go to help fund their art, or help to fund their works and that. What we see within Street Rainy Day is this modern urban city. We see that the city streets are starting to expand. We talked about that before, and the housing are starting to become more standardized, giving them the Paris feel that we think of today. And this is the hustle and bustle of this urban street with people going about their day. But the commentary that he's making that's kind of interesting is that there's a little interaction between people, showing that the changing image of the community in the modern world, right? Rather than people interacting and people knowing each other's names, right? Here we see two individuals going out, and the main focus of going out is to be seen, right? They're worried about others seeing them and wanting others to see that they're not just sitting back in their apartments doing nothing, right? They're actually out there. They're important people. They have things to do. They have operas to go to, or ballets to connecting it what they got to go to. That this new rising wealthy class, they want to be seen as socially important. And so this takes a look at some of the shallowness of this capitalist changing society within this particular world that's emerging. And just to kind of think about his particular work in connection with realism, right? Just as a kind of thought here, I want you to think about whether Caillebotte's work fits more with Impressionist style, or his work shares more elements with Impressionism and realism. Because in a lot of ways, his style itself is hyper-realistic. If you take a look at the umbrellas here, and how the sky, the cloudy sky, is reflecting that kind of shine off the umbrella because it's just a little bit wet. Or if we take a look at the cobblestone streets of Paris, and they're just kind of pooling up just a little bit with water, it's hyper realistic. And so in some ways it has elements of realism, but also I want you to think about what elements of Impressionism this particular work has. So, and just to conclude, I just wanted to kind of get back to Tolstoy's argument, right? Tolstoy argues that past art, it was about beauty, right? Being pretty, right? That idea of beauty is, well, how close it imitates something, or how well it creates pleasure, or this emotional quality, or fits in with the canon, how, the past art. What we see in the modern world is that art is about a communication of ideas. It's about trying to remove the boundaries between the art and the artist. And when you think about how Impressionists are doing that, how they fit into that, and then think about how well they fit into that, right? So just some common themes to think about as we move forward.